Good morning, everybody. My name's Andrew Forth. I'm the Head of Policy and Advocacy at Climate Group. I'd like to welcome you here today to today's session on what's next for green trade in an evolving landscape. We live in a world where a lot of people have decided that all attention is good attention, and if they're right, I think it's pretty inevitable that we'll soon have trade policy influencers popping up on your favourite social media channel. I've got three people who would probably fit the bill as being experts and being charismatic speakers on that, so I'm very much looking forward to being able to hand it over to them rather than you listen to me. For a bit of an introduction, for those of you who don't know what Climate Group does in this space, we work with businesses to drive climate action. And one of the issues that comes up over and over again with the businesses we work with is, what does this new world of trade, policy and disruption mean for our attempts to decarbonise our operations, whether that means disruption to supply chains for renewable electricity generation, tariffs on steel, making it more expensive to do things. It's a whole mass of complications for industry. I'm really grateful to be joined by three experts today who are going to helpfully help us untackle some of that and also answer the question of how can we turn trade from something which has been a source of disruption at the last couple of COPs and threatens to be again at the next COP into something which really helps to kickstart climate change. I've got three esteemed panellists who I'll introduce in the order that they will speak. Today's format is really going to be conversational. Please do ask any questions that you have as the event goes on. So, to introduce my panel, I've got Valerie Hickey, who's the Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank. She's worked on environmental and development programs around the world and oversaw the implementation of the World Bank's commitment on climate change, climate mainstreaming and climate finance. I'm going to do violence to your surname, I apologise. So I've got Yeva, I'm just going to call her that, from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. She leads their work on trade and the green transition. She's a former diplomat for Lithuania, as Deputy Permanent Representative to the WTO, and she was co-chair, apparently, of the long one, the WTO Committee on Subsidies and Countervailing Duties, and Vice Chair of the OECD Joint Working Party on Trade and the Environment. And finally, I am delighted to be joined by the first panellist I've ever had at one of these who has his own Wikipedia page, Dan Esty, who is the Hill House Professor of Environmental Law and Policy at the School of Environment and Yale Law School. Together with Jan-Yves Remy, who we had hoped to be able to speak today, but unfortunately unable to, he's one of the leads of the Reimagining Global Trade project. The format today is going to have short introductions from them. I'm going to then use my prerogative as moderator to ask them a couple of additional questions. And then I'm really hoping that we can get into a conversation around what does the future hold for trade and the environment? How can they reinforce each other rather than being barriers to progress? So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Valerie to start.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I'm just going to correct one thing you said. I'm not an expert. The great thing is I'm sitting on this panel to learn. And I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Carolyn Fisher, who is the bank's expert on climate and trade and has been trying to give me a quick 101 on this. But this is a really, really important topic. And it's important for two reasons. At the World Bank, like in many places, we believe in the importance of open, transparent, and fair trade. We also recognize that we're living in a world where starting 5 or 6 years ago, things started to change. It was COVID, conflict, and climate change. It means it's been huge supply chain disruptions. It means that global trade didn't look so smart when you couldn't get what you were hoping to, whether you were part of a value chain, somewhere in the supply chain, or a consumer trying to buy something. It led to huge inflations and price spikes in different parts of the world, and scarcity in places where there wasn't a lot of surplus to begin with. But trade has been an invaluable instrument that we've supported to try and end poverty, because that's our job. And we know there's never going to be a world without poverty in a world without open, fair, and transparent trade. And that's super important. But when it comes to thinking about climate change and trade, sometimes the road to hell can be paved with good intentions. And of course, it matters to our clients, emerging markets, developing economies, that we can bend the curve of emissions to zero. Because otherwise, they're living in a world of boom and bust when it comes to trying to get out of poverty. This is true of poor communities everywhere. It's true of poor countries, small islands, small companies, where they're building up assets, they're getting out of poverty only to be hit by a flood, a sudden shock, only to have to live through the slow motion misery of drought and desertification and lose everything that way. So battling climate change matters. But doing it through trade can create short-term hurt in exactly those places where you're trying to lend a helping hand. Because there are three things that we think about a lot when it comes to these sort of non-tariff trade barriers. First is how much are they actually going to help? Particularly when you think about, for example, the European Union's CBAM or the EU's deforestation-free regulations, both of which are really well thought through, and they could be very important tools. But we have to remember that in emerging markets and developing economies, half of their trade is between each other. It's not between the global south and the global north. That's twice as much as it was in 2000. Second thing we have to remember that it's firms, not countries, who seek market access. And third thing, lots of those firms, even where they're big companies, big brand names, are comprised of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions small growers or small suppliers. And so when it comes to sustainability and trade, and this matters, we have to remember those at the bottom end of the supply chain. Think about the 4 million farmers, smallholder farmers in Ethiopia, who grow the coffee that goes into the supply chains that ends up in the coffee out there. And whether they're able to meet the compliance costs of being part of a supply chain that is now policed very differently. It's not an easy one. It can add 30 to 40% of the cost of that agricultural product. That's a lot when you're already living on tiny margins. And that's why for us, and I'll end on this, Andrew, two things we're thinking about very much in terms of our role to help countries, for example, the 11% of agricultural produce that we worry is at risk because of the EU deforestation-free regulation. Two things we think are critical to helping those supply chains remain robust and remain where they are so they don't move countries and they don't move away from those small farmers, those small suppliers who are the very ones it's our job to help. One, we have to get the data standardized and simplified. We need AAA data. It has to be accurate, of course, but it has to be accessible and it has to be affordable. And we have to build a monitoring, reporting, and verification system that's robust around that because the cost of compliance only goes up when everybody has to figure it out by themselves. And the second thing, particularly when it comes to the agribusiness commodity space, where an awful lot of these rules tend to inflict costs, we have to work on land rights, particularly for women, particularly in those 40% of countries where there are regulatory barriers to women owning land at a time when, because of climate change, in places like North Africa, 9% of the country is moving from rural spaces to cities. And that's not everybody, that's mostly men, leaving women behind with their kids on tiny plots of land where they don't have land ownership. And this is happening everywhere in the world. So data and robust architecture around that data so you can reduce compliance costs through standardization and simplification, and thinking about land rights to make sure that, again, that compliance cost is reduced.
Thank you, Valerie. One of the things that's a big challenge in this is the low and middle incomes are the countries who are least equipped to deal with the transition in the sort of economy towards a more climate and trade related discussion, but they're also probably the countries in which you can have the biggest impact if we can get that right. You've talked a bit about the importance of data. Do you see what do you see as the World Bank's role in terms of helping that capacity, or is it encouraging partners or encouraging industry? How do you see that going next?
You know, I think there's two parts to that question which I find very interesting. So often we're putting in place these trade barriers where emissions are highest. You know, right now we have emission trading systems covering about 28% of global emissions. It's a good start, it's nowhere near enough. But often the impact are in those places where emissions aren't particularly high to begin with. You know, look at the whole of sub-Saharan Africa and you're talking about less than 4% of global emissions, much less if you take out the Republic of South Africa. And so when you think about carbon intensity and where the emissions are, are these the best tools? It's an important question. It's hugely helpful within the EU to have CBAM and to have an ETS. We have to think about the impact it has in emerging markets and developing economies, and that's why our role is to make sure to give a hand up to those countries, communities, small companies who want to remain engaged. And that's why one of the things we're doing is really thinking through how do we create an end-to-end ecosystem that works for taking data, standardizing it, simplifying it, so that the costs of compliance are reduced. And not just for each new trade policy, but for carbon markets, for the new Tropical Forest Forever Fund that the Brazilians and other countries are putting together, all of which require data on particular things, and too often for which we're creating new data systems that are parallel, that are almost the same but not quite. That's adding cost at a time when we don't have that money to spare. So one of our jobs really is thinking through what's the end-to-end infrastructure that needs to be created, where data is simplified, it's standardized, and you can reduce the cost of compliance so you can keep those small suppliers, whether they're small farmers, whether they're smaller countries, in the supply chain, because at the end of the day, that is one of the most tried and trusted path out of poverty.
Thank you very much indeed. I can turn to you, Yeva. Yeva, you are an incredibly expert voice on carbon border adjustments. I'd love to hear your perspective on all things carbon border adjustments, but it might be helpful to give a bit of context to those who are in the room as to what exactly we're talking about when we're saying a carbon border adjustment, because CBAM is a funny sounding word, but it's not well understood by a lot of businesses out there.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Look, and I think Valerie already started taking us to a place where carbon pricing is rising globally. Those are good news for us and for the battle towards 1.5 degrees, but not fast enough. But let's leave it aside. The question is, what happens when you start taxing the biggest emitters domestically? The market inside becomes a bit more expensive for those producers, and there is a potential for the exporters from other countries who will make those products cheaper because they are not being taxed in their countries of origin. There is no global carbon price, as you all know. We have not managed to agree upon that, and those differences in price levels or price and no price makes the process that we call, or rather the risk of carbon leakage. That means that your emissions will move from a country of higher price to a lower price, and the lower price jurisdiction will keep on using the higher priced market to export the high emissions products there. To avoid that, countries with higher prices aim to introduce instruments that are called border carbon adjustments. And this is a process that Valerie has mentioned. What it does, it applies a tax at the border to tax the emissions that have not been taxed at the export jurisdiction. So say domestic carbon price is $100 and the exporter is only paying $10. That adjustment should add additional $90. We're talking about the future, of course. It does not exist yet. Now, when the discussions about CBAM started, it was only the European Union, and it was such a pioneering, novel instrument that we all could not stop talking about it for a couple of years. And it's a novel instrument, and there are a lot of issues around that. But the world has shifted very meaningfully from there. We have the United Kingdom that has confirmed that it will introduce its own border carbon adjustment mechanism. Australia is moving that way, as well as is Chinese Taipei, Norway, Iceland. Seriously considering such instruments are countries like Canada, as well as even Turkey, potentially Brazil. Any country that is thinking about more meaningful domestic carbon price needs to start considering the risk of carbon leakage. It's unavoidable. That's the only way to politically sell the domestic carbon price. You need to make sure that your producers will be protected from higher emission competition from abroad or cheaper emission competition abroad. So where we are, you would think that all those countries should be discussing between themselves and try to at least make the compliance costs lower. That's what Valerie was talking about. Each of those new regulations means additional costs for exporters, not only in terms of carbon price, but also the compliance cost, because you need to track the emissions across the production of a specific product. So you need all of your suppliers to be reporting you the emissions data, you need to accumulate it, and you need to show how much each of those suppliers have paid for their emissions. Maybe doable and possible in the European Union, but when we're talking about quite a few countries across the globe, not so evident. And that's why I think when we're thinking about the impact to those countries of those new regulations, we need to think about the learning curve that will need to happen to those producers in those countries. The European Union had 30 years to implement its emissions trading system. For many of those countries, this learning will need to happen in the next couple of years because the charges for the European Union CBAM are starting to be accumulated next year already. Now, the discussion is only starting, and we know that UNFCCC is not really doing terribly well in that. We are still discussing on whether those charges have a right to exist or not. But we are in a world where that does exist, and the exporters will have to pay. So the question, as Valerie mentioned, is what can we do to make it easier? And you would think that in the ideal world, the countries would get together, figure out a plan, at least to ease up the minimal amount of administrative burdens towards those exporters. But because each and every CBAM is different, it mirrors the domestic carbon pricing system. That's a very challenging thing to do. And this is why our organization has come up with a guidance document for governments as they are discussing this trade facilitation measure, this potential political agreement to ease up the life of exporters, including in developing countries. We have released our guidance for border carbon adjustments that looks into so many details that need to be thought through by developing country, well, by the countries who are developing their own instruments. So, for example, how do we measure and report the emissions? What are those requirements? What do we cover in terms of goods and scope? Do we cover scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, perhaps? What do we do and how do we use the revenues collected for the CBAMs? How do we credit for the carbon prices paid at the domestic jurisdictions? How do we treat the exports? Can we talk about export rebates? Should we? And what do we do with developing countries? Really, do we need to provide them with horizontal exemptions? Do we need to facilitate somehow and provide lighter conditions? Do we need to credit their prices differently? We have worked with 30 experts globally, experts coming from not only civil society organizations, but also from business community, from investors, from the workers' unions. And we came up with recommendations that we hope will help people to think about what needs to be done in a collective manner.
Thank you very much. Yeva, just to look into that one bit, one of the things that this is all a conversation that's connected to particularly green industrial policies and how are countries looking to develop green industrial bases and help the industries either develop that are good for the environment or make the transition from being highly polluting towards more sustainable. What do you think trade's role in green industrial policy needs to be? A nice small question for you to consider there.
Easy questions only, right? Trade is a force multiplier. We know that. Trade can strengthen good trends and bad trends as well. If you were thinking and just stepping on the footsteps of recent plastics negotiations, we know that we can either control the most harmful substances from being traded or most harmful plastics from being traded globally, or we can just let it all go and reduce tariffs for them. And we'll have an outcome towards which we are working. And equally, this is what the green trade's role is about. We need to think about how to make greener trade flow freer across the borders? How can we actually enable those developing countries that really have lighter carbon footprint in this world to trade their products freer across the globe? How can we enable that trade to go? But also, how can we make sure that they can benefit from this new green economy that is being developing right now? So how can we build up those new green industrial policies that make sure that the markets of the future are accessible to those countries?
Thank you very much. Dan, I'll turn to you now. Really great to get your perspective on what's been said, but also hear more about the future, the Reimagining Global Trade project that yourself and colleagues have been working on.
Andrew, thank you, and thanks to the Climate Group for a wonderful organization of the program here in this room, but across this whole 2 days here in the Hub Live. And thank you all for joining what I think is going to be an important conversation, and ever more so. You've heard from both Valerie and Yeva. We're gathered at a difficult moment. I think we may find today, literally today, we face the low point of an 80-year project of trying to build a cooperative world. And it's particularly important for us here to say there are reasons why the world constructed a United Nations 80 years ago, and almost 80 years ago, a trading system that brought people together. The alternative, as demonstrated twice or 3 times over in the first half of the 20th century, was horrific. And seemingly, at least one leader of one important country is ignorant of that history and unaware why investments in institutions matter, why cooperation as a strategy is preferable to everyone on their own, with a presumption that the world is a zero-sum place. So that's the starting point. But you've also heard, and I agree, that the climate regime is struggling, and the trade regime, as a result of President Trump's tariffs, is in collapse. Not entirely, but in substantial ways. The structure created over many, many years, and I think successfully so, not perfect, but successful, has been burned down. And I think as a result, we now have what could be seen as a challenge, but I prefer to see it as an opportunity. So here's why. With the space cleared by the burning down of the trade house, we get to imagine what things might look like in a different future. And I think that's the opportunity we need to step into. What should people who care about a cooperative world, who think collaboration has a place, who believe that trade is critical to lifting countries out of poverty, what do we do together? And I think the other opportunity that's emerged is that countries that were uncertain about whether to really fight for a trade system are now realizing that the United States is not going to do the job, and they better step up, particularly across the global south. So we suddenly have a whole new dynamic of who's ready for and leading the effort to rethink trade. So let me just spend a minute or two more on what that means. Let's ask what the climate system needs, because we now know, maybe we didn't know 80 years ago as these systems were emerging, that there's deep interdependence. You can't have a trade system on one track and a sustainability strategy or a climate change regime on another. And in that regard, I think we are seeing every day the reality of a climate system that suffers from what academics would call the free rider problem, or the prisoner's dilemma problem, where we end up with parties committed to take action together to decarbonize, and yet when somebody defects from that commitment, everybody else says, well, I was willing to go along, but not if my competition isn't there required to do the same things. And that's true at the country scale and even more so at the industry scale. So we have a really serious problem, and I think the answer, and again, this is well established for those who have spent time studying game theory, particularly by the famous John Nash, who tells us that we should expect, without coordination, to have a lose-lose outcome. And I think the climate regime has now demonstrated over 30 years the vitality of John Nash's observation of 50 years ago, that this is the logical outcome absent intervention to keep people cooperating without a structure of discipline. So the question I asked the climate change crowd 30 years on, having been one of those who negotiated the 1992 Framework Convention, I think we thought we were doing the right thing, but it's clearly insufficient. So what do we need? We need a system that penalizes companies and countries that would defect from the commitment to a sustainable future, to climate change action in particular, and penalizes them for any competitive advantage they might get for not adhering to the commitment to reduce emissions. as a start. In the end, by the way, I'm not in favor of carbon border adjustment. I'm in favor of sustainability border adjustment, a broader concept that would take up the idea that any effort to get a competitive advantage by ignoring fundamental commitments to sustainability as a principle of life in the 21st century should be penalized. And I think we have an opportunity to do it over the next couple of years while we are imagining a new trade system. And I think in that regard, the Remaking Trade project that you mentioned has gathered a network of 400 thought leaders who are contributing ideas to this. We produced something called the VLAR Framework for a Sustainable Trade System. So ideas were extracted from a dozen workshops over several years and presented to 100 and something thought leaders gathered in the Swiss mountain town of VLAR, thus the VLAR Framework. And it does lay out critical elements of what a remade trade system might look like. And I'll just put several of these ideas on the table. We can dig into them as time permits. So number one is standards. We need common standards of sustainability that we're going to hold people to. And they need to be done on a basis that is legitimate and analytically rigorous and scientifically grounded. And there are folks out there in this community working on that agenda. And I think we now need to figure out how to pull it into the trade system as a foundation for trade going forward. Number two, we need to fundamentally rethink the WTO, the trade systems approach to subsidies. Currently, the world of the trade folks in Geneva ask only one question when a government support to a company or an industry is challenged, and that is, does it disrupt trade? From the point of view of the Remaking Trade project, that is not the right question, or at least not the right first question. The first question should be, what's the purpose of the subsidy? And frankly, you need to respond to the subsidy very differently if the subsidy is sustainability enhancing versus sustainability diminishing. And I'm not creating sustainability as a centerpiece of the trade system. It actually is in the first paragraph of the Marrakesh Agreement that set the World Trade Organization going in 1995. So when I push this, I'm simply saying to those in the trade world of Geneva, let's get serious about this overarching mission of the trade system and make sustainability the centerpiece of your analysis. So again, fossil fuel subsidies should be cracked down upon much harder. Production-based agriculture, cracked down upon much harder. You don't have to, by the way, get rid of all the farm subsidies. The politics of that would be tough, but repurpose them to support sustainable agriculture. And by the way, apropos of the discussion on green industrial policy, if someone's got subsidies to promote renewable power, I would argue presumptively those are okay in the trade system because the overarching purpose is to produce a sustainable future. So I do think there's other questions that have to be answered and asked in parallel. Every company here is thinking about how to become a net zero producer by 2050. Well, we need a net zero greenhouse gas emissions trade system by 2050. And alignment of trade with the climate change regime should be a part of the conversation. And the final piece, which again we've touched on, is how do we ensure that developing countries who come to the conversation about this trade and sustainability interface from a different starting point, in many cases with very low historic emissions, how do we ensure that they're helped to meet these emerging standards and not held out of markets with the suggestion that the standards being put forward are a form of green protectionism? So let me stop there, and I hope we can dig into this more in detail.
Thank you very much, Dan. The issue of green protectionism was a major source of discussion at COP29 in Baku. It's probably going to be one at COP30 in Belém. And if you've had the pleasure of reading a BRICS summit communique, there is some fantastical language in there, but a constant theme has been not using sustainability regulations to disrupt trade. It would be really great if you could just give a bit of background to the audience as to where this concern really comes from and how you think that could be addressed going forward. And that, I'd like to widen that out to the whole panel after Dan's made some thought.
So let me start by saying I think if you take climate change seriously as an existential threat, or sustainability more broadly as a fundamental principle for life in the 21st century, you can't say, oh, give us a pass, we're too poor to comply, or it would be such a burden, it would add cost to our production. you have to say something different, which is everybody has to meet this standard. We need to work on a transition strategy to get you there, but it can't be seen as green protectionism. Having said that, I do think the CBAM as currently constructed has flaws that should be addressed. And I'll quickly highlight those and we can discuss it. Number one, it's being done unilaterally. It would be much better done if it was part of a broader conversation. And the European Union will tell you they've consulted widely. Having sat in Geneva, a lot of people don't feel that. So how they feel about it is important. Number two, I do think the European Union has insisted on data to underpin the calculation of a tariff that meets certain European standards. A lot of countries and companies can't meet that standard and get penalized with a presumption against them in the calculation of a tariff. There is, I think, also a really important need to focus on not explicit carbon pricing alone, but in a world of diverse climate change policies, implicit carbon pricing, and any number of things that contribute to climate change policy that should be credited. And finally, I do think the European Union is doing a disservice by not wanting to talk about this developing country question. The VLR framework, by the way, has a very good answer I wish the European Union would take up, which is to repurpose the little sister of the trade regime. Everybody knows the WTO, most people know UNCTAD, but the little sister is the International Trade Center, or ITC. A whole group of folks in Geneva, hundreds of people, working to help small and middle-sized enterprises in the global south become trade ready, with work on tariffs and how to post bonds and all sorts of things that are technical. Why not repurpose that group as a sustainable trade center, helping develop the capacity in those small and middle-sized enterprises to meet sustainability market expectations and the emerging standards, and help them to trade as opposed to simply leaving them to be obstructed by these emerging standards.
Thank you. Eva, you've sort of been much closer than I have to the discussions around the practicalities of CBAM. How, from your perspective, how is it a question of they haven't consulted widely enough, or they were deliberately creating what is an environmental rule but is actually a trade rule?
Let me take the question from the beginning. I do believe it's a trade rule. I do not think that CBAM is a climate instrument. It's a trade instrument that's meant to support the climate objectives, but it has border in its name, right? We know that it's a trade instrument, despite anybody trying to say so. And this is what border carbon adjustments are. Those are instruments that can lean very easily towards climate or towards protectionism, depending on their design. And as Dan rightly points out, right, EU's instrument was the first one. I think globally the agreement is quite wide that the consultations were not as exhaustive as they could have been, and a lot of developing country governments are finding themselves in a bit of a pickle trying to advise their own exporters on what to do in this new world. Now, you asked about BRICS, and I just want to turn back to kind of the interesting combination of those countries and what different role each of them is playing in the trade and climate space. Because those countries might be the key to unlocking the new type of cooperation, or whatever cooperation that could be there. Because you do have Brazil working currently on their emissions trading system. You do have China doing the same. You have India probably not speaking too much about it, but really looking into that. So the change in the approach and in the climate ambition is there. This is not to say that all of them will start embracing CBAMs, as they shouldn't. CBAM is a very individual instrument, and it works for some, but it won't work for countries that don't have market to be attractive enough. So EU and Fiji are not at the same place when it comes down to CBAMs. But there are multiple other instruments that can be employed to further the trade and climate agenda. And here, I think Dan has mentioned subsidies. I don't think I necessarily sign up to the sustainability subsidies idea, but I think it really depends on which side of sustainability you are coming from. When talking to smaller developing countries, we see a lot of them being quite concerned about kind of this huge SDG-sized gap for any sustainability related subsidies, because they're asking the think tanks such as ours of what would happen to them if the major economies would all throw the subsidies into one direction that would drive their own producers completely out of a market. What could their role be in that new world? And I think it's a conversation that is very important to have. We know that subsidies are the name of a game, but how to employ them is really something that we still need to talk more about. Thank you.
And Valerie, one of the big challenges in this is it's the richest countries who are most able to subsidize the decarbonisation that will help you lower your CBAM liabilities in a way. What sort of, beyond concern and opposition, what sort of conversations are you seeing in the countries the World Bank's working in around how to address the reality on the ground of CBAM, what it means for their exporters and their domestic industry?
I think one of the biggest challenges is uncertainty. And what we're hearing a lot in our client countries is just uncertainty. Because the trade rules get pushed back, nobody's quite clear what compliance looks like. The compliance regimes are changing, they're different. And in a world where we work a lot, particularly on the public sector side of the World Bank Group, in the pre-competitive space for micro and small businesses, for example, getting them a good business track record, a credit history, so they can go to their local money market, their local domestic capital market, if there is one, to access money. None of it matters if the banker they're going to get a loan to start up their new company, and it could be a highly innovative new technology, new climate technology, if the local banker says, you want to be part of a supply chain, but we're just uncertain as to what the costs of entering that supply chain are going to be because there's so much uncertainty in the system. And so one of the things that we look for and we talk about a lot is that for everything related to development, certainty matters. Private sector and private capital flows in when there's some certainty. That's why regulatory reform is so important. It's why making sure there are predictable, stable rule of law. And trade uncertainty isn't helping. And so that's something we hear a lot and is one of the things that we look to the countries that do have CBAMs, where they're going to put them in place to make the rules of the game as clear as possible. And then we can help the countries, as Dan said, lift up to where they're able to meet those rules and meet those standards, and the cost of compliance doesn't come at the cost of them being part of supply chains.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left, 12 minutes left to be precise, I think. And I think it'd be really good to get your perspectives from all of you on where we're going to be in 5 years' time. And I ask that maybe excluding where we are sitting right now, but in the kind of the global discussion, will carbon have become a mainstream factor when determining what you pay at a border, what customers will pay, and is that going to be enough, or do we need to do more? So Dan, you look.
So I very much hope that we are 5 years from now out of a world of non-cooperation broadly and back to a world where we recognize that the human species has done much better in periods where we have found ways to cooperate. And this is not an observation even of the last century or 80 years of the UN. It's an observation of 30,000 years, going back to when the first cave people found that they could hunt together and get much more than hunting alone, or those in the Tigris and Euphrates valleys who decided they could compare notes on how to grow food and did better by comparing notes than doing it all on their own. So I think we have some fundamental lessons to relearn. I hope by then we will have learned them. And I hope we are back to building a trade system that supports poverty alleviation, provides opportunities for economic growth, but is redesigned with sustainability built in at the base. And I'll just close with an answer to Yeva's pushback and a suggestion for Valerie in this regard, which is I think it is a fair worry in this global south, particularly of small countries. It really is actually not south-north, it's big-small, where countries worry about, on the small side, not being able to compete with subsidization. So my view is the World Bank should open a subsidies match window And any country that has a sustainability concern should say to the World Bank, we are eager to get into this industry. We're competing with those who are getting government subsidies in a big place. We want your help in helping our industry in this category, where we see ourselves as globally competitive, to get a little bit of support to get going in the marketplace.
You know, the wonderful thing is, Dan, we do something like this. I mean, in terms of, in Turkey, for example, their industry is preparing for the CBAM. And they're using this as a reason to provide, to get some capital investment, to get new technologies into their industries that can be competitive, both in terms of cost, but also in terms of their carbon emissions. And we've actually provided their industrial bank $300 million so they can provide a much reduced concessional loans to those industries so that they can do now what they may not have been able to do for the next few years. And so I think this is a role that we think of very carefully, is how do we make sure we can support local money markets, local domestic markets, public development banks, to make the capital available to make their businesses competitive. And it's having that certainty of understanding how long is a piece of string. What is competitive in a market where, particularly in the climate space and the carbon space, things are changing a lot?
I'm just hoping that in 5 years, the bank can really direct those investments to comply with as little regulations as possible. I hope that we're really at much better place in agreeing on which direction we're going, right? Where do we put our subsidies? What type of environmental regulations do we put up, and how can we best coordinate on them so that those that need to comply with that can actually capitalize on those markets, so that that green trade can really enable the countries growing out of poverty with the support of a bank and the excellent advice of Dan's, right?
Thank you. One issue that has come up a couple of times is around carbon leakage. I come from the UK, where we're very proud of having reduced our carbon emissions significantly. We've also lost basically our entire manufacturing base. We produce almost no steel. So when you look at the carbon impact of the UK, we've just moved it to somewhere else. We've made it somebody else's problem, but at the same time, it's all of our problems. How do you think that businesses can really start to make an impact in this discussion? Because at the end of the day, yes, a lot of steel gets bought by the public sector, but the innovation and the demand needs to come from businesses, and they are kind of at the mercy of the politicians when it comes to the world trading system as it currently stands. If you were advising the businesses in this room, what would you be telling them to hope for?
I think you could simply say you want a trade system that has standards that are transparent, clear, carefully structured, analytically defined, science-based, and then everyone held to those standards. And once business has a clear standard, there's a lot of innovation that occurs on top of that. And I do think we have a lot of businesses now that are suffering the consequences of this competitive disadvantage by stepping forward on sustainability, and we need to break that dynamic.
Our experience when working in different countries on the globe showed that a lot of businesses are still hoping that the green wave will pass and the sustainability requirements will become a thing of the past rather than the reality of the future. I think that you need to make sure that the businesses, especially those coming from energy-intensive industries, understand how much the trading landscape will change for them in the next few years and start making investments towards that. The investors need to think and project instead of trying to catch up with every new regulation, and that will put them a foot forward, right?
You know, I think we all have to remember what trade does at the end of the day. When you have an open and free trade system, goods and services will be produced where they're best comparatively advantaged to be produced. What competitiveness means is changing. And that's what's interesting. And for businesses, you're trying to figure out where that competitiveness edge is going to be, because they want to be rewarded as first movers, not penalized, as Dan was talking about, for doing something that nobody else has to do. And so that's a really interesting part of the discussion. But I think we shouldn't forget that government regulation does matter. It will matter. It has always mattered. And that businesses should look at governments as market makers in terms of what they do on procurement. Increasingly, procurement is used as a tool, just like trade, to try and drive markets and to try and change how markets move. And so one of the things businesses are trying to do is you're trying to figure out where that competitiveness arc is, where the frontier is. Procurement policies are a great way to think through where that frontier is.
And can I just add a footnote to Valerie's point? There's been some very interesting work done by the recently departed chief economist of the World Trade Organization, Ralph Assa, on green competitiveness. And he's finding very interesting results that go to this question of whether the Global South should push back on or welcome a lifting of sustainability standards. And it turns out that with geography sort of broadly envisioned, there are two parts of the world that are actually enabled and made more competitive by a baseline of sustainability standards. And number one is Africa, because of the great potential for low carbon energy. And number two is Latin America, where again, there's a good base for low carbon energy and also a whole lot of the minerals and materials that the world is going to need to move this direction. So it turns out, to Valerie's point, you shouldn't just assume this is all going to work against you. You should step in and actually ask, can we find ways to make this new structure of sustainability as a baseline work for us?
This was the most interesting thing I heard at the Second Africa Climate Summit in Addis 2 weeks ago, was this idea of no longer seeing green competitiveness as a tax, as a challenge, as a barrier, but as an opportunity. And figuring out, how do you use your sunshine dividend? The fact that as climate technologies, and particularly clean energy technologies, are shifting, the cheapest power is going to be in the places with the most sunshine. And that's not where people like me from Ireland live. And that's going to shift where what green competitiveness means. And it is about opportunity, and that's what's exciting. And I think that's something we hope the COP can do. It's something we hope that the conversation around climate can do. Shift from always being in the Cassandra stance of woe is us, it's all bad, and really think about where are the opportunities and how can we begin to see this as a win-win. You can bend the curve of emissions, you can help countries and communities prepare for the worst impacts of climate change, and you can end poverty.
That's an inspiring message, I think, and I think hope is a very valuable thing, and sometimes in politics and climate, it's been in quite short supply. I think, and I hope, we can start a debate which gets us to a more hopeful place and to a more cooperative place. In the last minute that we have, I was just going to try and summarize some of the things that were said. I think the comments around the importance of standards and the importance of certainty are something that businesses will echo in almost everything. But I think in an uncertain trade world, it really matters. I think it's clear from this conversation and from others that we need to find a way to address the concerns of developing economies around the move towards carbon as a basis for trade. And I think finally we need to find a way to have this conversation framed around how do we drive climate action. It's not just about driving more better trade or smoother trade, it's around driving green and sustainable trade. On that note, I would like to thank my panel for doing all of the work for me. Dan, Yeva and Valerie, thank you so much for contributing your expertise, and please give them a warm round of applause.